My stepfather, Riley Walker, worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, and it was a steady job, but uncertain, because trucking had hurt the railroad by then and they were cutting back. Riley had only a little seniority, and he was always getting bumped, a railroad term that meant moving to another job when you were forced out by someone with more seniority who wanted yours. In turn, my stepfather bumped someone with less seniority than he had. As a result, my childhood was spent moving from one railroad town to another, each one smaller and more remote than the one before. This constant moving gave me a sense of restlessness, of always being near the edge of something, but of freedom, too, and loss. I learned that I didn't have to feel attached to anyone, except my mother, stepfather, and my Uncle Jake, and even that changed eventually. My mother faced these frequent moves with patience and relentless good cheer for the most part. Her first item of business was to measure the new windows. Then she sewed bright, colorful curtains and seemed even cheerier once they were hung. "That civilizes the place a bit," she'd say, and Riley would nod and agree. "Just like home." I'd glance up from the railroad housing linoleum. It was my task to scrub the floors with disinfectant, trying to remove any trace of germs left by the former tenants. And I'd try to say something encouraging. But the packing and loading were always difficult, and we worked like coolies, if you want to know the truth. The moving pattern was recognizable. After we'd been in a place about a year, one night Riley would delay coming home while he stopped off for a couple hours at a tavern near the railroad depot, commiserating with the buddies he'd be leaving, and working his nerve enough to tell my mother. Supper finished, she'd stand anxiously by the door, sipping a cup of hot tea and watching the twilight settle. Riley always carried a small gift when he arrived late, candy or scented candles perhaps, and she'd thank him and reheat dinner while I went into the front room to watch TV and sulk. They'd talk with lowered voices at the kitchen table, and I'd hear the clink of Riley's fork and knife, my mother fixing more tea. Her voice always caught a few times, and one phrase I'd hear was, "Riley, when's all this going to stop?" Then he'd attempt to say soothing, comforting words such as he was building up seniority all the time, or he'd heard the schools were good in Harney or Grass Valley, small towns near the railroad sidings where we lived. When the towns became too small to offer comfort, he'd say it was good for a boy to have room to roam, and rural people still had good values. After they went to bed, I usually didn't hear anything except a few sighs, until the night my stepfather announced we were moving clear across the state to Griggs. Then my mother cried. In the morning hours, I went to the bathroom sink for a cold glass of water and found her lying naked on the tile floor. A wet washcloth covered her face, and her skin seemed flush, as if she had a fever. My turning on the light had startled her, and she bolted upright for a moment, whipping the washcloth from her eyes and calling out, "Griggs! Griggs!" Then she settled back like a child in a restless sleep. We'd usually have about 2 weeks before the actual move, enough time to make arrangements for the mail, utilities, and phone. I'd mope around school a little, wringing sympathy from my teachers and a few classmates. Most of the kids had lived on family farms, generation after generation, and I was just a newcomer to them anyway. The teacher might suggest a going-away gift, and the class would bring dollars to buy a book or a basketball. They'd dutifully sign their names, and I'd promise to remember them and write, but of course I never did. My mother always conferred with my teachers and took careful notes about my subjects so I wouldn't fall behind in the shuffle. She dressed well for those conferences, and when I saw her standing alongside my teachers, I was surprised how pretty she was, and how her ash-blonde hair shone in the sunlight.